Happy Friday, all you beautiful soul travelers joining me on this spiritual journey. It is Gordon Majak here, back with another episode. And today I wanted to talk about one of the challenges that I've experienced on my spiritual journey, and I think it's probably common for a lot of us. And that is choosing a particular spiritual path or not, or a spiritual teacher or not. So I want to just give you a little bit of my background and how I have sort of navigated this over the course of my life and see if this rings true or gives any insights and perspectives for those of you who are out there on that journey like me. So let me go back to the beginning. Now, I did not get raised. I was not raised with any particular religious or spiritual path or values or church or anything like that. I think my very earliest memories of anything like that was when I was a very small child, just only maybe 4 or 5 years old. My beloved grandmother used to take me to church with her. She was a devout Catholic, and she used to take me to church with her. But none of that ever really stuck with me, and that was not a path for me. But that was sort of my earliest spiritual memory, per se. Now, I would say that in hindsight, my spiritual journey really began when I was a teenager. And the earliest sort of connection that I think I made was in a lot of the music that I was hearing as a teenager. And this is back in the early 70s. You know, I think of artists like John Lennon. A lot of his lyrics had spiritual themes. Certainly artists like Earth, Wind and Fire and Stevie Wonder. There were spiritual concepts and spiritual ideas, spiritual truths even, I would say, embedded in a lot of those lyrics and a lot of that music that I grew up listening to. And being such a passionate fan of music as I have always been, that was probably really the thing that first sort of opened my eyes when I was 13, 14, 15 years old back there in the 70s. That was sort of the first thing that really brought a spiritual awareness to me. Now, from there, that turned into, I would think, the first spiritual book, quote unquote, that I remember reading as a young man was Khalil Gibran's classic, The Prophet. And I think I was still in high school when I read The Prophet the first time. And that had a huge impact on me. Of course, Gibran, such poetic language, such a beautiful writer, and his ability to capture those timeless, just eternal, immortal concepts and convey them through his writing was just so powerful. And that had a huge effect on me as well. And that's, I would say, my best memory is that would have been in the mid-70s there when I was still in high school, maybe 1975, 74, 75, 76, and in that area. And that's also when I was listening to a lot of that music that I mentioned earlier, you know, John Lennon, Earth, Wind and Fire, Van Morrison, Stevie Wonder. So much of the music back then, there was a spiritual angle to it if you looked hard enough and dug through it. But really my first exposure to a spiritual teacher, now, well, I take that back. Now, when I was in high school, I had a couple friends that were very diehard, what you would call born-again Christians. And there was about a 2-week period, 2 or 3 weeks maybe at the most there, where I sort of flirted with that idea of being a Christian, quote unquote. And I went to church a few times with my friends. But as soon as I figured out that really the church for them was more about chasing the girls that were also in the congregation at church, that sort of, once I saw that was kind of the end of that for me. And that message, the Christian message, didn't really resonate with me all that much to begin with. So I knew I didn't really want to be a Christian, at least not as it was defined at that point. But the real breakthrough came for me in 1981, and that's when I was 23 years old, and that's when I met my first real spiritual teacher, and who later went on to become my personal spiritual teacher, and who I studied with for many years. And that was my beloved teacher, La Maestra Elizabeth McDonald Burroughs. I met Elizabeth in 1981. And one of the things that happens on the spiritual journey is that when you become aligned with a teacher, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, when you study with a specific teacher, you become aligned with a teacher. And I think especially on the physical plane, their spiritual lineage and their spiritual teachers sort of become your teachers. So through Elizabeth, I discovered her teachers, who were number one, the great, the man, the soul that I consider to be sort of my spiritual grandfather. If Elizabeth Burroughs was my spiritual mother, and I believe she was and is, then certainly Professor Edmond Bordeaux-Zeke, who was the direct teacher of my teacher. Certainly, Professor Zeke was my spiritual grandfather. Now, Edmond Bordeaux-Zeke, best known, of course, for his incredible work translating and writing the Essene Gospels. And there's a whole body of work that I could go into, and I will absolutely go into at a later date in another episode. I will absolutely go into the profound effect that Professor's writing and his work has had on me, because it's far too much for this episode to go into. But through Elizabeth, I found first Professor, and then secondly, Manly P. Hall. Now, I may have heard the name of Manly P. Hall, and I may have even seen his, well, of course, he was such a prolific writer in his own right, but The Secret Teachings of All Ages, that was a book that had quite a profound impact on me as well. And so through Elizabeth, by meeting Elizabeth and studying with Elizabeth there, that led me to Professor Zeke and then to Manly P. Hall. Eventually, that also led me to another one of my favorite teachers, which is Paramahansa Yogananda. And Paramahansa, I had a connection with him on the inner plane for a while that was quite beautiful. When I very first started meditating, I used to meditate with Paramahansa, and there was a very profound connection there in the very early days of my meditations. Back then, this would have been, I'm thinking, late 1990s, when I was in my 40s there. What happened with Elizabeth was I first met Elizabeth in 1981, studied with her there for maybe a year or so, maybe 2 years. And then I sort of lost track with her and went off and did my own thing. And that's when the 80s and 90s, the New Age thing was really just sort of coming in. And, I got all caught up in all kinds of New Age stuff there in the 80s and 90s and went through all of that. But as my teacher used to say, as Elizabeth used to say, she was very firm about this. I don't know that I necessarily followed it as firmly as she intended it. But teacher always used to study only the works of the illumined masters. And I think to a large degree, I took that into account, and that did influence me. But I occasionally strayed into some other, what you would call the lesser mysteries. So Elizabeth McDonald Burroughs led me to Professor Zeke, and that led me to Manly P. Hall, eventually Paramahansa Yogananda. And as far as physical teachers on this physical plane, in this earthly plane, I think I would fast forward from them and say certainly the works of Eckhart. Eckhart's probably, of all the modern day masters, Eckhart is probably the teacher that I've felt the greatest and the strongest and most profound connection with. But certainly so many books, I mean, not only by Elizabeth and Professor Zeke and Manly P. Hall and Paramahansa, I mentioned that, of course, Paramahansa wrote Autobiography of a Yogi. His book, Man's Eternal Quest, had a huge impact on me as well. I mentioned Professor Zeke's books on all of the Essene Gospels. Elizabeth Burrows herself wrote quite a number of books. I was very influenced and very impacted by her book, Pathway of the Immortal. And eventually, years later, toward the end of her life, her and I teamed up and did a revised version of that, because she had originally written Pathway of the Immortal. Wonderful book, a wonderful sort of a spiritual outline of life. We came back around there in her later days and teamed up on a rewrite of that. Boy, it's so hot and sweaty in here. But certainly as far as books, the Tao Te Ching, probably if you put a gun to my head and forced me to choose a single text, a single teaching to live with for the rest of my life, it would probably be the Tao. I think in terms of the overall big picture, spiritual picture of life, I think the Tao is perhaps, I won't say exclusively or definitively, but it is perhaps the highest and purest teaching that we have. That's in my humble opinion. The Tao Te Ching in turn led me to the Hua Hu Ching, which is the oral teachings of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, of course, was the author of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching led me to the Hua Hu Ching. That led me to the Dhammapada, which was the oral teachings of the Buddha. And it just goes on and on from there. And really, those are sort of the primary influences and the primary teachers, the primary teachings that I followed. But going back to the musical side there just for a second, back in the mid-1980s, Van Morrison, the great singer Van Morrison, who I just love, put out an album called No Guru, No Method, No Teacher. And those words always stuck in my mind because it really has typified my spiritual journey. I have studied with spiritual teachers. I was a student of Elizabeth's for several years, and she's the one that ordained me into her spiritual center, the Christian Church of Universal Peace, because Elizabeth was a Christian mystic. So, yes, I have studied with individual teachers, most notably Elizabeth, but that Van Morrison song, or album, I should say, No Guru, No Method, No Teacher, that really resonated with me because that described my path. I've never been a person, and perhaps I think maybe this has held me back even a little bit, because I always felt like, and this is where the challenge comes in, I should choose a particular path. I should choose a certain teacher. I should only follow this or that or the next thing. But I think, ultimately, I think that sort of limitation, maybe it works for some people. Maybe you're one of those people that there is just a certain narrow path for you. And I don't mean narrow in a bad way at all, but I mean a defined specific path, and you feel compelled to follow that. And by all means, you should. If your heart and your soul feel drawn in that way, to follow exclusively a given teacher or a given teaching or a book or however you want to characterize it. If that's what speaks to your heart and your mind and your soul, then by all means do that. But for me, it's always been more of a smorgasbord. Life has always been more of a spiritual smorgasbord. I take a little bit from all of the things that I love. I've taken a little bit of influence from so many different things. And the only real discrimination or differentiation I've tried to make is I've tried to remember what my teacher taught me about only reading the works of the masters. And so going back to that New Age thing there in the 80s and 90s, and even into the 2000s, when the New Age thing was really booming and going there, that I went down a lot of little roads, a lot of little side alleys, and a lot of little paths off the main road there, so to speak, that didn't end up having much of an impact on me. But I was always exploring. I was always open, and I was always interested in absorbing what I could. And on the flip side of that, there have been other teachings that have been extremely popular that I, for whatever reason, just did not resonate with me and did not have any impact on me at all. And I think about something as popular as A Course in Miracles. I'm sure you've all heard of A Course in Miracles, and some of you may be huge fans of A Course in Miracles and may follow. I don't know if that's a teaching that you necessarily follow, but I know so many people have referenced it and talked about A Course in Miracles. I'll tell you, I, excuse me, I was exposed to the truth and to A Course in Miracles many, many years ago, 40 years ago, 45 years ago, something like that, back there in the 80s. And it just, I have to tell you, it just never had any sort of, I'm sweating to death here, hang on. It never had, A Course in Miracles just never had any sort of impact on me at all. I just did not resonate with that material. I know other people who absolutely swear by it, and it's their favorite spiritual texts. And those people may not give 2 seconds of attention to the Tao Te Ching like I did, but they really resonate with A Course in Miracles. But I just use that as an example. I'm not promoting it, or I'm not arguing against it. Nothing like that. The opposite. As I said, I think it really is a smorgasbord, and I think it's up to each of us to find the path, find the teacher, find the book, find the teachings, find what resonates, what vibrates with you, what's at the frequency that speaks to you, what speaks to your soul. There are past life connections, obviously, that run through so much of this way of thinking. We all have past life connections, not only with just the individuals in our life, but with teachers and with teachings, and we may have been in different schools and in different disciplines. I have no doubt at all, going back to the Tao Te Ching for a second, I have no doubt at all that in some previous life somewhere, maybe in China itself, I don't know, China, India, wherever the Taoism may have really taken root. Obviously it came out of China, but wherever that teaching may have spread, I have no doubt that at some point in previous lives, I was a student of the Tao, because I just know from the extent to which it speaks to my soul, even still in this life. Something like the Gospel of Thomas, if we go back to this idea of mystic Christianity, and my teacher that I mentioned, Elizabeth Burrows, she exposed me to the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels, right? There was another thing. Even though I wasn't a Christian, I've never have been a Christian per se, and I don't study the Bible. I have read the Bible and I have studied it, but I don't consider myself a Christian, and I don't regularly read the Bible. But the Gnostic Gospels always spoke to me. So that's another example of, the mainstream teaching, the mainstream direction may have been Christianity and the dogma and everything else that's a part of that, but that never worked for me. That never spoke to my soul. I was always much more interested in things like the Gnostic Gospels or the Essene Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas. So I throw out all of these things, not these names and these books and these teachings and these pathways. I'm presenting these to you in this video just to show that it is a smorgasbord out there. And I believe we should not allow ourselves, or should not confine ourselves, unless it speaks to us, unless it's what we feel drawn to, that we should not confine ourselves to a narrow scope. If you want to be a Buddhist monk, I support that completely, okay? If you want to be a Christian mystic, I support that completely. If you want to be a student or a devotee, I guess, of someone in the modern day here, like Eckhart Tolle, I totally understand that. I love Eckhart. And I see a lot of Eckhart in the Tao, by the way, or I should say a lot of the Tao in Eckhart. I think I have a secret theory that there is a connection between the Tao and Eckhart, maybe a past life connection there. That's just my own little theory, my own hunch. I think Eckhart may have been very, very closely aligned with the Tao in a previous life, and certainly I think his teachings in this life are in many ways aligned with the spirit of the Tao. And as I said, I love the Tao and I love Eckhart. So I just wanted to sort of put this out there and speak to this a little bit, because it is such a challenge. And I know for myself, in some ways, it's been difficult for me, because at various times, I've judged myself and sort of critiqued myself, or about, well, why didn't I follow this exclusively and into a deeper level? And why didn't I become a teacher of that? And this sort of thing, this sort of limited thinking. But really, at the end of the day, for me, my path, if I'm being honest with myself, my path, I recognize, is much broader and much more open. And as I've said, I've pulled wisdom, and I've taken to heart the teachings of so many different things, and that's what works for me. That's the path that works for me. But I would love to hear from you guys. How is this process? How is this concept sort of played out on your life, in your spiritual path, in your spiritual journey? Have you confined yourself, and I don't mean that in a bad way, have you limited yourself, don't mean that in the bad way, to a particular avenue? Or is it more expansive and more of a smorgasbord, like it has been for me? I'd be very curious to know how you guys have sort of navigated that, because for me, it's been all over the place to an extent. But just as there's been, just as on the same token that I could, tell you, make a list of my favorite teachers and my favorite books, there's also been, those that I've shunned, or those that shunned is not the right word, those that I researched or examined and then ended up discarding. Some things stick with you and some things sort of fall away, right? That's what I've come to. And now, as I said, as I sit here, it's kind of like the greatest hits. I think back to the music that really impacted me there in my teenage days, and it's so funny how all of these things are connected. There's a thread that runs through all of these things, from the music to those books to Gibran and the Prophet to the lyrics in the Van Morrison song, and the idea of no guru, no method, no teacher. And the rest of that lyric, by the way, is no guru, no method, no teacher, just you and I in nature, in the garden. I always love that. What a beautiful thought that was from Van Morrison. Love Van. Some very beautiful spiritual music if you're into Van Morrison. Boy, he had a run there in the 80s and the 90s where he's always been a very spiritual guy, but he had a run of albums there in the 80s and early 90s that just had a very profound impact on me, and still do to this day. So many great lyrics and great spiritual messages in those songs of Van Morrison. So shout out to Van Morrison. Love you, Van. The Tao, the Ching. Man, there's one of the all-timers for me. That's probably the top of the heap for me. But I still, I think to my teacher, and as I said, Professor Zake and Manly P. Hall, it just goes Paramahansa. It goes on and on and on. So many wonderfully diverse teachings, wonderfully diverse personalities. And you put it all together in that melting pot, and this is what you wind up with. So I wanted to share that with you guys today. We'll be back either later today or tomorrow, certainly over the weekend. And as time goes on, we will delve into, or I will delve into some of these individual teachers and teachings, and get deeper into some of the things that I want to share with you guys in that respect. I hope you have a beautiful Friday afternoon and evening, and I will see you in the next one. I'm going to put some links in the body of the video here. I'll put some links down below there for you to check out some of the teachers and some of the texts that have meant so much to me. And we will see you in the next one. Love you all so much. Take care out there.